The steel deck vibrates beneath their boots. November 1944. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, aboard the destroyer USS Fletcher, the smell of fresh coffee drifts through the passageway. In the ship's mess, sailors sit elbow to elbow, forks scraping against metal trays. Hot apple pie, mashed potatoes with gravy, roast beef still steaming. Outside, the sun burns white over an endless blue horizon. The war is close. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Japanese aircraft carriers maneuver, searching. But here, in this moment, men eat. They drink coffee from ceramic mugs. They complain about the pie crust being too dry. They joke, they smoke. They finish their meals and return to their stations, stepping over the knee knockers in the narrow corridors, moving back toward the guns, the radar screens, the engine rooms. This is routine. This is normal. 300 miles northwest, aboard the cruiser Kumano, Imperial Japanese Navy sailors sit in darkness, rice rations dwindling, water rationed to a cup per day. They have not tasted fresh meat in weeks. They do not complain. Complaining is not the way of the warrior. But they wonder privately, silently, how much longer the steel can hold against what is coming. The war in the Pacific had been raging for nearly 3 years by the time those sailors sat down to apple pie in November 1944. It had begun with fire and humiliation. Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning ambush that shattered American battleships and left over 2,000 dead in the oily waters of Hawaii. In the months that followed, the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon. The Philippines fell. Singapore fell. The Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Burma, one by one the colonial outposts crumbled. Japanese carriers ruled the seas. Their pilots were the finest in the world, veterans of campaigns in China, men who could land a zero on a pitching flight deck in total darkness. By mid-1942, Tokyo controlled an empire stretching from the edge of India to the islands north of Australia. A conquest so rapid and complete that it stunned even Japan's own military planners. But empires built on speed are fragile. The same distances that Japan had conquered now became chains. Every island garrison needed food, ammunition, fuel. Every airfield required spare parts, concrete, laborers. Every fleet needed oil, and Japan had almost none of its own. The conquered territories in the Dutch East Indies produced crude, but refining it, transporting it across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, distributing it to scattered naval bases, this was logistics. And logistics was not Japan's strength. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been designed for a decisive battle, a single climactic confrontation, in which superior skill and fighting spirit would annihilate the enemy in one bold stroke. It had not been designed for a grinding war of attrition across an ocean the size of the moon. America, meanwhile, was waking up. The industrial heartland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Gary, shifted from automobiles and refrigerators to tanks and ships. Shipyards in California, Virginia, and Maine worked around the clock, arc welders throwing sparks into the night. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond could produce a Liberty cargo ship in 45 days. Bethlehem Steel in Quincy, Massachusetts, laid down destroyer escorts in assembly line fashion. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new warship every single day. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. Steel poured into the sea faster than the Japanese could sink it. But it wasn't just the ships. It was everything that came with them. Fuel tankers, repair ships, hospital ships, refrigeration vessels, ammunition barges, floating dry docks. America didn't just build a navy. It built an entire mobile industrial base, a floating city capable of sustaining itself indefinitely in the middle of the ocean. This philosophical difference ran deeper than strategy. The Japanese military culture, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, valued hardship as a crucible of character. Suffering purified the spirit. A true warrior endured hunger, thirst, exhaustion without complaint. Comfort was weakness. Luxury was decadence. Japanese officers believed that harsh conditions sharpened fighting spirit, that deprivation bred resilience. Rations were minimal by design. Rice, pickled vegetables, occasional dried fish. Water was rationed even when supplies were adequate, a form of discipline. Medical care was basic. Wounded men were expected to endure pain stoically or, if too badly injured to fight, to die with honor. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior, and it permeated every level of the Imperial Japanese Navy from admirals to engine room crew. The Americans approached war differently. They believed in efficiency. A well-fed sailor worked harder, thought clearer, fought better. A man who slept in a clean bunk with a full stomach was more effective than a man starving in the dark. This wasn't coddling, it was industrial logic. The U.S. Navy studied nutrition, caloric intake, vitamin deficiencies. They installed ice cream machines on carriers. They rotated crews off the front lines for rest. They provided hot showers, clean uniforms, mail delivery, even Coca-Cola when possible. Entertainment officers organized movie nights on the hangar decks. Chaplains held services. Medical staff treated everything from combat wounds to athlete's foot with equal seriousness. To the Japanese, this seemed incomprehensible. To the Americans, it was simply good management. By 1943, the gap was already visible. American submarines patrolling the waters around Japan began sinking tankers faster than they could be replaced. Japanese fuel stocks dwindled. Training flights were cut back. Carrier pilots who once logged hundreds of hours before combat now received a fraction of that. Meanwhile, American pilots trained in Florida and California, flying until they could navigate by stars, land in fog, hit a moving target from 3,000 feet. When they arrived in the Pacific, they were backed by an infrastructure that seemed infinite. If a plane was damaged, another appeared. If ammunition ran low, a supply ship pulled alongside within hours. If a man was wounded, he was helicoptered to a hospital ship with a full surgical suite, X-ray machines, blood plasma, antibiotics. The war was becoming industrial, and industry was America's native language. The United States Navy's logistical system in the Pacific was unlike anything the world had ever seen. At its heart was the Service Squadron, an unglamorous fleet of supply vessels that rarely appeared in headlines but made everything else possible. Fleet oilers capable of refueling destroyers while underway at 15 knots. Refrigerated cargo ships called reefers packed with frozen beef, butter, eggs, vegetables. Ammunition ships with holds full of 5-inch shells, torpedoes, depth charges. Repair ships equipped with machine shops, welding equipment, spare turbines. Hospital ships painted white with red crosses, staffed by surgeons who had trained at Johns Hopkins and Mass General. These vessels shadowed the fighting fleet like an invisible supply chain, appearing when needed, fading back when the shooting started. They allowed American task forces to operate thousands of miles from the nearest base for months at a time, without returning to port. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood that battles were won, not just by superior firepower but by superior endurance. He built a system called Mobile Logistics Support, a network of floating bases that could leapfrog forward as the fleet advanced. Ulithi Atoll, a tiny ring of coral islands in the Caroline Islands, became a major anchorage where hundreds of ships could resupply simultaneously. Tankers would pump fuel, cargo ships would transfer ammunition, freshwater distillation ships would pull alongside, their desalination plants converting seawater to drinking water at thousands of gallons per hour. Sailors could receive mail, shower, eat hot food, even watch movies on floating recreation barges. Then they would steam out again, fully provisioned, ready for another month at sea. This system didn't just sustain the fleet. It allowed it to operate at a tempo the Japanese could not match. Japanese naval logistics, by contrast, had been designed for a war that no longer existed. In the 1930s, Japanese planners had envisioned a conflict where their combined fleet would sortie from home waters, meet the American fleet somewhere near the Philippines, win a decisive engagement à la Tsushima in 1905, and force a negotiated peace. Supply lines would be short. The battle would be brief. Endurance wouldn't matter, because the war would be over in weeks. This doctrine had shaped everything: ship design, training, provisioning. Japanese warships carried minimal food stores. Crew quarters were cramped, poorly ventilated, often unbearably hot in tropical waters. Refrigeration was rare except on the largest vessels. Medical facilities were rudimentary. There were no hospital ships in the Imperial Navy. Wounded men were treated aboard their own vessels or left to die if injuries were severe. Resupply was meant to happen in port, not at sea. When the war turned into a grinding campaign across thousands of miles, these assumptions collapsed. Japanese supply convoys became targets for American submarines. which prowled the sea lanes between Japan and the occupied territories with deadly effectiveness. By late 1943, Japanese merchant marine losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of tons sunk every month. Ships carrying rice, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, reinforcements, all went to the bottom. The few convoys that got through were barely enough to sustain frontline garrisons, let alone maintain quality of life. Japanese sailors began experiencing what would become the defining reality of their war: hunger. Not starvation, not yet, but constant gnawing hunger. Rice rations shrank from 3 meals a day to 2, then to 1.5. Fresh vegetables disappeared. Meat became a memory. Fish, when available, was often spoiled by the time it reached the ship, because there was no refrigeration. Vitamin deficiencies appeared: beriberi, scurvy, night blindness. Men grew thin, their uniforms hanging loose. The cultural response to this deprivation was stoicism. Japanese naval officers, schooled in Bushido, emphasized spiritual strength over material comfort. They gave speeches about the samurai who had endured winters in the mountains with nothing but rice and determination. They reminded their crews that suffering was the forge in which the Japanese spirit was tempered. Physical hardship, they insisted, was temporary, but the honor of service was eternal. Many sailors believed this or tried to. They endured without complaint, sleeping on hard metal decks, drinking lukewarm water from rusty tanks, eating rice mixed with weevils. Complaining would have been shameful, but belief could not fill an empty stomach, and as the months wore on, the physical toll became undeniable. Men moved slower. Reaction times dulled. Disease spread in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Morale, that intangible quality that keeps men fighting when logic says to surrender, began to erode. American sailors, meanwhile, lived in a different world. The U.S. Navy mandated 3 hot meals a day, every day, even in combat zones. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, orange juice. Lunch could be soup, sandwiches, fresh fruit. Dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, pie or cake for dessert. The menu varied, but the standard remained. Navy cooks, trained at specialized schools, prepared meals in galleys equipped with industrial ovens, grills, steam kettles. Refrigeration was standard on every vessel larger than a PT boat. Meat was frozen and stored in walk-in freezers. Vegetables came in cans or increasingly frozen in new flash-freezing technology. Milk was reconstituted from powder. Bread was baked fresh daily. Some carriers even had soda fountains where sailors could get ice cream between watches. This wasn't luxury for its own sake, it was policy, based on nutritional science and morale studies. A well-fed crew was a combat-effective crew. The contrast extended beyond food. American ships had bunks with mattresses, not hammocks or bare decks. Ventilation systems circulated air through living spaces, crucial in the tropical heat. Freshwater showers were available, albeit sometimes rationed during extended operations. Laundry facilities allowed men to wash their uniforms regularly. Medical care was comprehensive. Corpsmen trained in combat first aid, doctors aboard larger ships, hospital ships equipped with operating theaters and recovery wards. Dental care, eyeglasses, even psychiatric services for men suffering from combat stress. Entertainment was considered essential. Ships carried libraries, recent movies, radio broadcasts when in range. Some vessels had ship newspapers printed aboard. Mail call, that lifeline to home, arrived with astonishing regularity considering the distances involved. Men could write letters knowing they would reach Iowa, Texas, New York within weeks. For the Japanese sailor subsisting on a bowl of rice and a cup of water, such abundance was unimaginable. It existed beyond the realm of possibility, a fantasy so absurd it couldn't be real, but it was real. And as the war ground on, more and more Japanese personnel would encounter this reality directly, through captured supply dumps, interrogations of prisoners, eventually through their own eyes when they became prisoners themselves. And when they did, the psychological impact would be as devastating as any torpedo. Angle 1. The human experience life aboard a Japanese warship in 1944 was an exercise in endurance. Below decks, the air hung thick and stale, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees in the engine rooms. Sailors slept in shifts on metal decks, their uniforms stiff with salt and sweat. There were no mattresses, no privacy. Men curled around machinery, finding whatever space they could. The toilets, called benjos, were crude, often just holes opening directly to the sea, swaying with the ship's motion. Bathing was rare. Fresh water was too precious to waste on hygiene. A man might go weeks without washing, his skin crusted with grime, his uniform reeking. Disease spread quickly in these conditions: dysentery, skin infections, respiratory illness. The sick bay, if it could be called that, was usually just a corner of a compartment with a few cots and basic medical supplies. Serious injuries meant agony or death. There was no morphine to spare, no penicillin, no blood for transfusions. Men suffered in silence because silence was expected. Contrast this with the USS Enterprise, a Yorktown-class carrier prowling the same waters. Below her armored flight deck, nearly 3,000 men lived in a city of steel. The berthing compartments were cramped by civilian standards but palatial compared to Japanese vessels. Racks stacked 4 high, each with a mattress and clean sheets changed weekly. Ventilation fans pushed air through the spaces, making the tropical heat bearable. The heads' Navy toilets had running water sinks, mirrors. Showers operated on a schedule, salt water for washing, fresh water for rinsing. The ship's laundry processed thousands of pounds of clothing daily. Men could hand in dirty dungarees in the morning and receive them back, cleaned and pressed by evening. The sick bay was a full medical department with examination rooms, a pharmacy, an operating theater, X-ray equipment, isolation wards for contagious patients, and a staff of doctors and corpsmen who treated everything from appendicitis to battle wounds. When a man fell ill, he was cared for. When he recovered, he returned to duty. This wasn't humanitarian sentiment, it was force preservation. The psychological impact of these conditions cannot be overstated. The Japanese sailor, hungry and exhausted, told himself that his suffering made him stronger, that the Americans were soft, that when the decisive battle came, Japanese spirit would triumph over American materialism. He believed this because he had to, the alternative was despair. But belief requires fuel and hunger erodes conviction. Every day the rations shrank a little more. Every night the heat made sleep impossible. Every week another shipmate fell ill or died. These accumulated like weights on the soul. By 1944, Japanese morale reports captured and translated after the war revealed what officers already knew. The men were breaking. Not openly, not in mutiny, but in the slow erosion of will, the creeping sense that the war was already lost. Angle 2. The technological gap. The refrigeration ship USS Aldebaran was unremarkable to look at. A converted cargo vessel with massive cooling units installed in her holds. But she represented a technological revolution. Her refrigeration systems could maintain temperatures below freezing across thousands of cubic feet of storage space, preserving meat, dairy, vegetables for months. She would rendezvous with fleet units at sea, pull alongside and transfer frozen provisions via highlines, while both ships steamed at 12 knots. The carrier would receive tons of beef, chicken, pork, butter, eggs, all frozen solid, ready to be stored in the carrier's own walk-in freezers. This technology, mundane by modern standards, was extraordinary in 1944. It meant that an American task force could operate indefinitely without returning to port for food. It meant sailors ate as well in the middle of the Pacific as they would have in San Diego. Japan had no such capability. The Imperial Navy had refrigeration units on some capital ships, battleships, and fleet carriers, but they were small, unreliable, and frequently broke down in the humid tropical environment. Most Japanese warships relied on dry stores: rice, dried fish, pickled vegetables, canned goods when available. These stores degraded over time, especially in the heat. Rice developed weevils and had to be cooked thoroughly to kill the larvae. Canned food, much of it produced years earlier, often spoiled. Fresh food was a luxury reserved for ships in port, and even then supplies were limited. As the war progressed and American submarines tightened their stranglehold on Japanese shipping, even basic staples became scarce. By 1945, some Japanese naval vessels were operating on emergency rations: compressed rice biscuits, seaweed, whatever local sources could provide. Men were not just hungry, they were malnourished, vitamin deficient, physically deteriorating. Water was another technological divide. American ships had distillation plants that converted seawater to fresh water using steam from the ship's boilers. These plants, called evaporators, could produce thousands of gallons per day, more than enough for drinking, cooking, bathing, and operating the ship's machinery. Water was plentiful. Sailors drank coffee throughout the day, unlimited. Cooks used fresh water for everything. Laundries operated continuously. The only time water was rationed was during battle, when every system was needed for combat operations. Even then, restrictions were temporary. Japanese ships had distillation equipment too, but smaller capacity, less efficient, more prone to breakdown. Water was always rationed. A sailor might receive a single canteen of drinking water per day, barely enough in the equatorial heat. Bathing was done with seawater, which left skin sticky with salt. Cooking used seawater too, making rice taste briny. Dehydration was constant, and with it came headaches, fatigue, diminished cognitive function, small degradations that accumulated into operational inefficiency. Angle 3. The strategic philosophy Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, understood logistics as warfare. In a 1942 memo to fleet commanders, he wrote, "The war will be won by the side that can sustain operations the longest, without returning to base." This principle shaped every decision. When planning an offensive, American strategists calculated not just combat power but supply requirements, fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, food stocks, replacement aircraft, spare parts. They built forward supply depots on captured islands, pre-positioning materiel before the fleet arrived. They established underway replenishment procedures, standardizing equipment and training across the fleet so that any oiler could service any ship, any ammunition vessel could resupply any cruiser. This was logistics as a weapon system, as important as guns or torpedoes. Japanese strategic thinking remained focused on the decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor to cripple American battleships, forcing a negotiated settlement before American industrial power could mobilize. When that strategy failed, Japanese planners still sought the one climactic engagement that would break American will: the Battle of Midway, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Operation Ago. Each time, Japanese admirals gambled everything on a single throw, believing superior fighting spirit and tactical skill would overcome material disadvantage. Logistics was something to be endured, not emphasized. Supply officers were low-status positions. Merchant marine duty was considered inglorious compared to combat command. The cultural focus remained on the warrior, not the quartermaster, the fighter pilot, not the cargo ship captain. This philosophy worked when supply lines were short and wars were brief. In a grinding campaign across the Pacific, it was suicide. Angle 4. The psychological impact hunger does more than weaken the body, it colonizes the mind. Japanese sailors in the latter years of the war reported that food became an obsession, a constant thought that intruded during every task. Men on watch would fantasize about rice balls, pickled plums, hot miso soup. Off duty, they would discuss meals they remembered from childhood, restaurants in Tokyo or Osaka, family dinners before the war. These conversations were bittersweet, a temporary escape that made the present hunger more acute. The psychological term is deprivation fixation, when scarcity makes the scarce resource dominate consciousness. Combat effectiveness suffered. Reaction time slowed. Decision-making degraded. Men made mistakes they wouldn't have made on a full stomach. Lookouts missed aircraft. Gunners miscalculated range. Engineers overlooked warning signs in machinery. These weren't failures of courage or discipline. They were biological consequences of malnutrition. American sailors, by contrast, rarely thought about food except in normal ways. Looking forward to a favorite meal, complaining about repetitive menus, joking about the cook's abilities. Food was a given, not a concern. This mental bandwidth freed them to focus on their duties. A radar operator could concentrate fully on his scope, without the distraction of hunger. A pilot could execute complex maneuvers without the cognitive fog of calorie deficit. Medical studies conducted after the war confirmed what commanders already suspected. Well-fed troops performed significantly better across every measurable metric. Morale stayed high. Cohesion remained strong. Men trusted that their needs would be met, allowing them to trust their leaders and their mission. This trust was a force multiplier, invisible but potent. The contrast created a psychological chasm that widened throughout the war. Japanese sailors began to suspect that their sacrifices were not matched by results, that endurance alone was not enough. They watched American planes appear in ever greater numbers, shiny and new, while their own aircraft became scarce, patched, obsolete. They saw American ships survive damage that would have sunk Japanese vessels, saved by superior damage control and abundant repair capacity. They heard rumors, some true, some exaggerated, about American abundance. Prisoners reported being fed 3 meals a day in captivity, better than they'd eaten while serving the emperor. These revelations created cognitive dissonance. If the enemy could afford such luxury even for prisoners, what did that say about Japan's chances? The psychological impact was corrosive, eating away at the ideological certainty that had sustained them. Angle 5. The enemy's prospective petty officer. Kazuo Sakamaki became the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by the Americans when his midget submarine ran aground at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Expecting execution or torture, he was instead taken to a POW camp in Wisconsin where he was given medical treatment, clean clothing, and 3 meals a day. His first breakfast stunned him: eggs, bacon, toast, milk, coffee. He assumed it was a special meal, perhaps to soften him for interrogation. But the next day, breakfast was the same, and the day after, lunch was soup and sandwiches. Dinner was meat, potatoes, vegetables. There was always dessert, pie, cake, pudding. He wrote in his diary, later published after the war, that he couldn't reconcile this abundance with his understanding of America as a decadent, collapsing empire. How could a nation provide such food to its enemies while fighting a global war? The cognitive dissonance haunted him throughout his captivity. As the war progressed, more Japanese personnel were captured. Sailors from sunken ships, airmen shot down, isolated garrison troops. Interrogators noted a consistent pattern: shock at American material conditions. Prisoners held aboard ships awaiting transfer to camps were fed the same rations as the crew. They saw sailors drinking coffee casually, eating fresh bread, complaining about the quality of the ice cream. One captured naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Toshio Abe, told interrogators in 1944 that he had believed American propaganda about Japanese superiority until he was rescued from the water after his destroyer sank. Aboard the American vessel, he watched sailors eat steak. Steak. He hadn't seen fresh beef in a year. The destroyer's mess was serving steak to ordinary seamen. He realized in that moment that Japan had been fighting an enemy whose logistical capacity was beyond comprehension. His report, transmitted through Red Cross channels, was suppressed by Japanese censors, but it leaked nonetheless, spreading through the fleet in whispers. The most devastating accounts came from Japanese sailors captured at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. These men, pulled from the water after the largest naval battle in history, had endured months at sea on dwindling rations. They were gaunt, many suffering from malnutrition-related illnesses. American sailors, horrified by their condition, shared their own food. The captured Japanese ate as much as they could stomach, then ate more, unable to believe the abundance. One prisoner, a machinist's mate named Hiroshi Tanaka, told interrogators through a translator, "We were told you were starving, that your ships were sinking, that your people were begging for peace. But you have more food than we ever did. How can we win against this?" The question was rhetorical. He already knew the answer. These testimonies, compiled in intelligence reports, revealed the psychological collapse happening within the Japanese ranks, not from cowardice, but from the dawning realization that industrial capacity, not warrior spirit, determined modern warfare's outcome. Angle 6. The industrial reality in 1944. The United States produced more steel than Germany, Japan, Italy, and Britain combined. American factories churned out aircraft at a rate of 1 every 5 minutes. Shipyards launched vessels faster than they could be named. This wasn't just mass production. It was mass production at a scale that redefined what industrialization meant. The resources devoted to feeding the military were staggering. The U.S. military consumed 10 million pounds of food per day: beef cattle from Texas ranches, wheat from Kansas farms, vegetables from California valleys, coffee from South American plantations, all flowing through a vast logistical network to feed soldiers and sailors across the globe. Refrigerated rail cars transported meat to coastal warehouses. Cargo ships carried provisions to forward bases. Smaller vessels distributed supplies to combat units. The system worked because it had been designed to work, engineered with the same precision as aircraft engines or naval guns. Japan's industrial capacity, impressive by Asian standards, was a fraction of America's. Japanese steel production in 1944 was less than 10% of American output. Food production was insufficient even for the civilian population, requiring imports from occupied territories. Imports that American submarines were systematically destroying. By mid-1944, Japanese merchant marine losses exceeded new construction by a factor of 5 to 1. The supply chain was collapsing. Rice shipments from Taiwan and Indochina couldn't reach Japan. Oil from the Dutch East Indies sat in storage tanks unreachable. The home islands faced food shortages that would become famine by 1945. The military, given priority, still received supplies, but even those were shrinking. Rations were cut. Quality declined. The gap between American and Japanese logistics was no longer just wide, it was unbridgeable. This industrial disparity manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into overwhelming advantage. When an American destroyer used up its 5-inch ammunition, a resupply ship appeared with fresh shells within hours. When a Japanese destroyer expended its ammunition, it might wait weeks for resupply if it came at all. American aircraft that suffered mechanical problems could be repaired with spare parts delivered overnight. Japanese aircraft sat grounded, cannibalized for parts because replacements didn't exist. American sailors whose uniforms wore out received new ones from ship stores. Japanese sailors patched and repatched until the fabric fell apart. These weren't trivial differences. They represented a fundamental imbalance in the ability to sustain operations. Wars of attrition are won by the side that can outlast the opponent, and by 1944, Japan was running on empty, while America had barely begun to tap its reserves. The psychological weight of this reality pressed down on every Japanese commander who understood the situation. They could see the numbers. They knew how many ships had been lost, how many aircraft destroyed, how many tons of supplies lay at the bottom of the Pacific. They knew the Americans were growing stronger while Japan grew weaker. Some admirals advocated for negotiated peace. Others insisted that fighting spirit could still prevail, that one great victory would turn the tide. But privately in diaries and letters captured after the war, many admitted what they couldn't say publicly. The war was lost. Not because Japanese sailors lacked courage, not because their tactics were inferior, but because they were fighting an industrial colossus that could produce faster than Japan could destroy. The coffee and apple pie aboard American ships weren't just luxuries. They were symbols of a productive capacity so vast it seemed almost supernatural. And against that capacity, all the Bushido spirit in the world meant nothing. October 24, 1944, the waters off Samar Island, Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history, enters its second day. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, comprising 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, has broken through San Bernardino Strait during the night. At dawn, they encounter what appears to be a miracle. Vulnerable American escort carriers off the coast, their screens thin, their aircraft mostly armed for ground support rather than anti-ship strikes. Kurita believes he has found the main American fleet. He orders general attack. His flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, opens fire with her 18-inch guns. Shells the size of small cars arc through the morning sky. This is the decisive battle Japanese doctrine had promised. Surface ships against surface ships, gunnery and torpedoes. The samurai confrontation that would validate everything they had endured. But something is wrong. The American carriers don't scatter in panic as expected. They launch aircraft, Wildcats and Avengers hastily armed with whatever ordnance is available. Some planes carry depth charges meant for submarines, repurposed as anti-ship weapons. Others have nothing but machine guns. They attack anyway, strafing Kurita's formation, drawing fire, buying time. The carriers make smoke, laying thick screens that obscure Japanese targeting. Destroyers and destroyer escorts, tiny vessels outgunned, outmatched, charged directly at the Japanese heavy units firing torpedoes at point-blank range, engaging cruisers with their 5-inch guns in a display of suicidal courage. The destroyer USS Johnston closes to within 10,000 yards of a cruiser column, launching her entire spread of torpedoes before retreating into her own smoke. She's hit repeatedly but continues fighting for over 2 hours before finally sinking, her captain going down with his ship. The Japanese ships are not merely facing desperate defenders, they are facing a system. Within minutes of the first contact, American radio networks light up with distress signals. Across hundreds of miles of ocean, other task groups receive the alert. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, pursuing a decoy force to the north, turns back at flank speed. Shore-based aircraft from Lady launch immediately. Submarines already patrolling the area alter course to intercept. This is coordinated warfare, enabled by communications technology that allows instantaneous command decisions across distances the Japanese cannot match. Their own communications are fractured, radio discipline breaking down under combat stress, orders misunderstood or delayed. Kurita's ships fight individually, each captain making decisions without clear coordination. The Americans, despite being surprised and outnumbered, fight as a unified organism. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something remarkable happens. Or rather, doesn't happen. At 09:20, with American carriers damaged and fleeing, with victory seemingly within grasp, Kurita orders his fleet to break off. He turns north, away from the vulnerable escort carriers, citing concerns about air attacks and the need to regroup. His staff is stunned. They have achieved surface superiority, the situation every Japanese naval officer had trained for. But Kurita has seen something his subordinates haven't fully grasped. The endless waves of American aircraft, the coordinated defenses, the sheer expenditure of ordnance that the Americans can sustain. His ships are hitting targets, but the Americans keep coming. He calculates, correctly as it turns out, that even if he sinks every carrier in front of him, more will arrive. The American logistics tale is infinite. His own ships are low on fuel, low on ammunition, and there will be no resupply. He withdraws. The survivors from Kurita's force making their way back through San Bernardino Strait pass wreckage from both sides. Japanese and American sailors float in the oil-slicked water, some clinging to debris, others already dead. American rescue operations begin within hours. Ships and aircraft crisscross the battle area, pulling survivors from the water regardless of nationality. The rescued Americans are taken aboard, given medical treatment, hot coffee, blankets, food. The rescued Japanese expect execution. Instead, they receive the same treatment: medical care, water, food. A pharmacist's mate aboard the destroyer escort USS Dennis treats a wounded Japanese sailor's burns, applying sulfanilamide powder and clean bandages, then hands him a cup of broth. The Japanese sailor, who speaks some English, asks why he is being helped. The American shrugs and says, "You're not fighting anymore. Now you're just hurt." That night, aboard various American vessels, captured Japanese personnel eat their first real meal in weeks. The food isn't special, standard Navy fare, whatever the crew is eating. But to men who have subsisted on rice and brackish water, it is overwhelming. One prisoner, a junior officer named Ensign Yoshio Nakamura, later told interrogators that he broke down crying after finishing his meal. Not from gratitude, he insisted, but from shame. His superiors had told him that Americans were weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. He had believed this while his own rations dwindled, while his shipmates grew thin and sick, while the hull of his cruiser rusted from lack of paint and maintenance. Now he sat in the mess of an American destroyer, watching sailors casually drink coffee and complain about the meatloaf being dry. He understood with devastating clarity that everything he had been told was a lie. The Americans weren't starving. They weren't collapsing. They were so materially superior that they could afford to feed their enemies better than the Japanese Navy fed its own men. Intelligence officers aboard Admiral Kincaid's flagship compiled reports from prisoner interrogations throughout the following days. The recurring theme startled them. Captured, Japanese personnel expressed less concern about being prisoners than about the discrepancy between their lived experience and what they had witnessed aboard American ships. They asked questions. How much food does America have? Where does it all come from? How many ships? These weren't tactical interrogations. They were existential inquiries from men realizing their worldview had been shattered. One petty officer, speaking through a translator, said, "We were told to accept hardship, that sacrifice would lead to victory. We accepted everything. We endured. But you?" He gestured at the coffee cups, the trays of food, the sailors moving about their duties with energy his own crew had lacked for months. "You don't sacrifice anything, and you are winning." The reports from Leyte Gulf filtered back to Japan through various channels: official dispatches, survivor accounts, whispered conversations. The combined fleet had suffered catastrophic losses. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 9 destroyers sunk or permanently disabled. Over 10,000 men dead, but the numbers, devastating as they were, didn't convey the psychological dimension of the defeat. What broke wasn't just ships. It was the narrative that had sustained Japanese naval forces through years of deprivation. The idea that spirit could overcome material, that Japanese discipline and training would prevail against American excess. That endurance itself was a form of victory. Leyte Gulf shattered these beliefs against the hard reality of industrial warfare. The captured sailors became unwitting messengers of this truth. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to provide only name, rank, and serial number. But many Japanese POWs, traumatized by the gulf between expectation and reality, talked freely. They described conditions aboard Japanese ships: the hunger, the thirst, the illness, the lack of medical care. They contrasted this with what they witnessed aboard American vessels. Interrogators, initially skeptical that the disparities could be so extreme, cross-referenced testimonies. The accounts matched. A consistent picture emerged. Japanese naval personnel had been operating on the edge of collapse, held together by discipline and ideology, while their American counterparts lived in what seemed like comparative luxury. The interrogation reports, classified and stamped secret, were circulated among Pacific theater commanders. Admiral Nimitz read them with grim satisfaction. The material advantage he had insisted upon, the refrigeration ships, the supply squadrons, the focus on logistics, was not merely sustaining operations. It was breaking enemy morale. December 1944. At Ulithi Atoll, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's forward anchorage, a Japanese pilot named Lieutenant Kiyoshi Ogawa prepared for his final mission. He was one of the newly formed special attack units, Kamikaze. His aircraft was fueled for a one-way flight to the American fleet off the Philippines. Before takeoff, he and his fellow pilots were given a ceremonial meal: rice, dried fish, pickled vegetables, sake. It was more than they had eaten in days, a gesture meant to honor their sacrifice. Ogawa accepted it with appropriate stoicism, but privately, in a diary recovered after the war, he wrote about the irony. He was about to die for an empire that could barely feed its warriors, throwing himself at an enemy that wasted more food in a day than Japan could produce in a week. He didn't question his duty. Japanese military culture had prepared him to accept death without hesitation. But the waste haunted him. Not American waste, Japanese waste. The waste of lives thrown against an opponent whose resources were, as he wrote, deeper than the ocean itself. His attack on December 13th, targeting the carriers off Luzon, was intercepted by American fighters. He never reached his target. His aircraft was shot down, burning into the sea. But he was not alone. Hundreds of kamikaze pilots flew similar missions in the closing months of 1944 and throughout 1945. These attacks were born from desperation, from the recognition that conventional naval warfare was no longer viable. Japan's trained carrier pilots were gone, killed at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and a dozen smaller engagements. Replacements received minimal training, often less than 50 flight hours before combat. They couldn't match American pilots who had hundreds of hours, who flew aircraft with superior performance, who could afford to lose planes and receive replacements within days. So Japan turned to tactics that didn't require survival. Crash the plane into the target. One plane, one ship, one life for maximum damage. It was mathematically sound in a horrifying way. It was also an admission of defeat, a recognition that Japan could no longer compete conventionally. The Americans adapted. Radar picket destroyers positioned themselves farther from the fleet, providing early warning. Fighter patrols increased. Anti-aircraft defenses were enhanced, ships bristling with 40mm and 20mm guns, but the kamikazes still got through. The carrier USS Franklin was hit on March 19, 1945, off the coast of Japan. The impact and subsequent fires killed over 800 men, the most casualties any American carrier survived. Yet Franklin didn't sink. Damage control parties fought the fires for hours. The carrier, her flight deck twisted, half her crew dead or wounded, limped back to Pearl Harbor under her own power. A 12,000-mile voyage. She was eventually repaired and returned to service. This was American naval resilience, the ability to absorb catastrophic damage and continue operating, backed by repair facilities, spare parts, replacement personnel, all flowing through that vast logistical network. Japanese ships, when damaged, often had no such options. The carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier battle, was hit by bombs at Cape Engano in October 1944. Her damage control teams fought valiantly, but lacked the equipment, the training, the materials their American counterparts had. Pumps failed. Repair materials ran out. The compartmentation that might have contained flooding had been compromised by earlier damage that had never been fully repaired. There had been no time, no facilities, no parts. She capsized and sank, taking 840 men with her. The difference wasn't courage or skill. It was infrastructure. By early 1945, the disparity had become absolute. American carrier task forces operated with impunity off the Japanese home islands. They launched strikes against targets that had once seemed untouchable: Tokyo, Yokohama, Kure. Japanese naval forces, depleted and fuel-starved, could mount only token resistance. The battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, was dispatched on a suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945 with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. There was no fuel for a return voyage, even if she survived. She was sunk by American carrier aircraft long before reaching her target, struck by an estimated 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs, capsizing with over 2,000 men still aboard. The Americans lost 10 aircraft. It wasn't even a battle, it was execution. The captured Japanese, from these final engagements, told stories that completed the psychological arc begun at Leyte Gulf. They spoke of ships that hadn't been properly maintained for months, of machinery held together by improvisation, of crews so malnourished they could barely perform their duties. They described watching American aircraft appear in formations of hundreds, wave after wave, knowing that their own air defenses could put up perhaps a dozen fighters, if fuel was available, if pilots were available, if the aircraft hadn't been cannibalized for parts. One warrant officer, pulled from the water after Yamato sank, told his interrogators, "We knew we were going to die. We had known for months. But we thought it would be glorious, that our sacrifice would mean something. Instead, we were just target practice." He paused, searching for words in a language he barely spoke. "You had so much, and we had nothing." It wasn't a war. It was an extermination. The comment was melodramatic, born from shock and exhaustion, but it captured a truth that statistical analyses and battle reports could not: the human experience of fighting a war that logistics had already decided. Every Japanese sailor who survived to become a prisoner carried this knowledge. They had seen American ships, American supplies, American food. They had lived the contrast between ideology and reality, and many of them, in the quiet moments of captivity, wondered what they had been fighting for, not because they were cowards or traitors, but because the evidence was overwhelming. No amount of spirit could conjure fuel from empty tanks, or food from empty stores, or spare parts from sunken supply ships. The war was over. It had been over since the industrial scales tipped past equilibrium, maybe as early as Midway, certainly by the time apple pie became routine aboard American destroyers, while Japanese sailors chewed rice infected with weevils. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and crackling through radio static, announced Japan's surrender. Across the Pacific, on ships and islands, in prisoner of war camps and occupation zones, Japanese military personnel received the news with varying reactions: relief, shame, numbness, disbelief. For those who had been captured earlier in the war and spent months or years in American custody, the announcement was less a shock than a confirmation of what they had already accepted. The war had been unwinnable. The evidence had been in every meal they ate as prisoners, every interaction with guards who treated them with professional detachment rather than the brutality they had been taught to expect, every glimpse of the vast American logistical machine that continued to function smoothly, even in victory. The repatriation process began immediately. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese military personnel scattered across the Pacific needed to be returned to the home islands. The United States Navy, which had spent 4 years perfecting the logistics of supply, now turned that capability toward humanitarian operations. Transport ships, many of them converted Liberty ships and troop ships that had carried American forces into battle, now carried Japanese prisoners home. The irony was not lost on the passengers. They sailed aboard American vessels, ate American food, received medical care from American personnel. Some ships had Japanese-speaking crew members who explained procedures, answered questions, even engaged in cautious conversation. The former prisoners learned that many of their guards had Japanese-American backgrounds, men whose families had been interned while they fought for America. The complexity of this reality defied the simple narratives both sides had constructed during the war. Medical examinations conducted during repatriation revealed the physical toll of Japanese military service. The average Japanese prisoner weighed significantly less than American personnel of similar height and age. Malnutrition was nearly universal among those captured in the war's final year. Beriberi, caused by vitamin B1 deficiency, affected roughly 30% of examined prisoners. Dental problems were endemic: cavities, gum disease, tooth loss from both malnutrition and lack of dental care. Skin conditions, parasitic infections, chronic dysentery. The list of ailments documented by American medical officers painted a picture of an armed force that had been consuming itself. By contrast, American personnel, even those who had endured extended combat operations, showed far lower rates of nutritional disease. The statistics were clinical, but behind them lay the human reality. One military had been fed, the other had been starving. Post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers provided deeper insight into the command-level awareness of these disparities. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata, who had served on the Naval General Staff, admitted in 1946 testimony that senior leadership had understood Japan's logistical inferiority by 1943, but saw no alternative to continuing the war. Surrender was culturally unthinkable. Negotiated peace required leverage Japan didn't possess. So they fought on, knowing the odds, believing or hoping that American will might break before Japanese resources ran out completely. The gamble failed catastrophically. American will, sustained by material abundance and steady progress, never wavered. Japanese resources didn't just run low, they collapsed entirely. By mid-1945, the combined fleet was essentially non-functional. Not because sailors lacked courage, but because ships lacked fuel, ammunition, parts, and trained crew. The human cost was staggering. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 300,000 personnel during the war, roughly half its total strength. Many died not in battle but from disease, starvation, or drowning after their ships were sunk far from rescue. The U.S. Navy lost approximately 36,000 personnel, a terrible price but proportionally far lower. The disparity reflected not just combat outcomes, but the underlying systems that sustained operations. American sailors who were wounded received prompt medical care. Those shipwrecked were actively searched for and rescued. Ships had sufficient life-saving equipment: rafts, preservers, emergency supplies. Japanese vessels often lacked even basic safety equipment, reallocated or never produced due to resource shortages. Survival rates for Japanese sailors whose ships were sunk were abysmal, sometimes less than 10%. For Americans, they were over 70% in most engagements. Logistics determined not just who won battles, but who survived them. The occupation of Japan beginning in September 1945 brought American personnel into direct contact with the civilian population for the first time. What they found shocked many of them. Japanese cities ravaged by strategic bombing were landscapes of ash and rubble, but more disturbing was the condition of the people. Malnutrition was widespread, not just among former military personnel but among civilians. Children showed signs of stunted growth. The elderly were skeletal. Food distribution systems had collapsed. The rice harvest of 1945 was poor, and with imports cut off by destroyed merchant marine capacity, famine loomed. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, immediately requisitioned emergency food shipments from the United States. Within weeks, American cargo ships began arriving with grain, canned goods, powdered milk. It was a mercy operation, but it was also a demonstration, another reminder of the industrial capacity that had won the war. Japanese civilians, encountering American occupation forces, experienced the same cognitive dissonance that captured sailors had felt. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that defeat would mean enslavement or death. Instead, they found soldiers who handed out chocolate to children, who set up medical clinics, who treated the conquered population with pragmatic fairness rather than vindictive cruelty. The occupation authorities established mess halls that fed both military personnel and Japanese workers. The food was American standard, wholesome, abundant, more than most Japanese had seen in years. Workers hired to assist occupation forces gained weight, regained health, and brought stories home. The Americans had so much food they threw away leftovers. They poured coffee down drains. They wasted nothing out of necessity but out of sheer abundance. These observations filtered through Japanese society, reshaping perceptions. Intellectuals, journalists, former military officers, people positioned to influence public opinion, began grappling with the question, how had Japan been so wrong about America? Wartime propaganda had depicted the United States as a crumbling empire, torn by racial conflict, weakened by democracy and individualism, on the verge of social collapse. Reality revealed the opposite. American democracy, far from being weakness, had mobilized resources and industrial capacity beyond Japan's comprehension. American diversity, portrayed as division, had produced Japanese-American soldiers who fought loyally while their families were interned. American individualism had not prevented collective action, but had channeled it through voluntary civic participation, rather than authoritarian command. The ideological foundations of Japanese militarism, the belief that spirit could overcome matter, that purity of purpose trumped material advantage, had been tested and found catastrophically wanting. The lessons extended beyond Japan. American military strategists analyzing the Pacific War's campaigns drew conclusions that would shape doctrine for decades. Logistics was elevated from a support function to a central element of strategy. The concept of tooth-to-tail ratio, the relationship between combat forces and support personnel, was studied extensively. The Pacific War had required enormous tail. For every combat ship there were multiple support vessels. For every fighter pilot there were mechanics, armorers, cooks, medics, supply clerks. This ratio, once seen as inefficient, was reconsidered as force multiplication. Well-supported combat units performed better, lasted longer, achieved more than unsupported elite forces. The Soviet Union, studying American methods, adopted similar principles in their post-war naval development. Britain, France, and emerging naval powers all incorporated lessons about logistics into their own doctrines. But perhaps the most significant aftermath was psychological. The revelation that material superiority had been decisive challenged romanticized notions of warfare. The samurai myth, that personal valor and martial spirit determined outcomes, was shown to be inadequate in modern industrial conflict. This didn't diminish Japanese courage. Countless individual acts of extraordinary bravery occurred throughout the war. But courage unsupported by logistics was courage wasted. Men could fight with empty stomachs, but not well. They could endure hardship, but it weakened them. They could believe in victory, but belief didn't create fuel or food or ammunition. The Pacific War taught in Blood and Deprivation that modern warfare was fundamentally industrial. The side that could produce more, supply better, sustain longer, that side won regardless of individual valor. For the Japanese sailors who survived, this knowledge was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it absolved them of personal failure. They had not been weak or cowardly. They had been undersupplied and overwhelmed. Devastating because it revealed that their sacrifices had been, in a strategic sense, futile. No amount of additional suffering would have changed the outcome. The war had been decided not in the moments of combat, but in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of California, the farms of the Midwest. Japanese veterans struggled with this realization for years, some for the rest of their lives. Many turned inward, refusing to discuss the war. Others became advocates for peace, arguing that Japan's militarist path had been a catastrophic error, not of courage but of judgment. The statistical record, compiled painstakingly in the years following the war, told the story in numbers. The United States produced 147 aircraft carriers during the war. Japan produced 17. American shipyards launched 349 destroyers. Japan built 63. American steel production in 1944, 81.3 million tons. Japanese production, 5.9 million tons. Food production, oil production, industrial output across every measurable category. The disparities were overwhelming. These numbers explained the apple pie, the coffee, the hot meals aboard destroyers in the middle of the Pacific. They weren't luxuries or evidence of decadence. They were the natural byproduct of a society capable of producing abundance even while fighting a global war on multiple fronts. And for the Japanese military, Conditioned to see hardship as virtue, encountering this abundance was more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. It revealed that the war had never been between equals, that Japan had been fighting not just America, but the entire industrial revolution's accumulated capacity, and that outcome had been inevitable from the moment the first shot was fired. Wars are not won by spirit alone. History remembers the battles, Midway, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, moments of fire and blood where courage was tested and lives were spent. But beneath those dramatic engagements lay a quieter truth. Logistics determines survival, and survival determines victory. The Japanese sailor who couldn't believe American troops drank coffee and ate apple pie aboard ships wasn't witnessing decadence. He was witnessing the physical manifestation of industrial capacity, the translation of factories and farms into floating cities capable of projecting power across an ocean. That coffee, that pie, they were symbols of a nation that had solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare: how to sustain operations indefinitely, far from home, without degradation of effectiveness. The Pacific War's true lesson was not about tactics or technology, though both mattered. It was about systems. Wars between industrial nations are contests of production, distribution, and endurance. The side that feeds its soldiers fights better. The side that maintains its equipment operates longer. The side that treats its wounded preserves experience and morale. These are not moral statements but mechanical realities as cold and certain as physics. Japan's warrior culture, for all its intensity and historical depth, could not overcome the arithmetic of supply chains. American pragmatism, often dismissed as spiritual emptiness, proved more effective than centuries of martial tradition because it recognized a fundamental truth. Human beings, no matter how disciplined or devoted, still need food, water, rest, and care. The men on both sides were human. They fought, suffered, died, and endured with courage that transcended nationality. But one side fought while eating regular meals, sleeping in bunks, receiving medical care when injured, and knowing that supply ships would appear when needed. The other side fought while hungry, sick, exhausted, and increasingly aware that no help was coming. This disparity, more than any weapon or strategy, decided the Pacific War's outcome. In the end, the conflict was not between warriors and weaklings, samurai and merchants. It was between two approaches to warfare, one that saw deprivation as strengthening, the other that saw it as waste. History rendered its verdict not in philosophy but in outcomes. The well-fed side won, the starving side lost. And in that stark reality lies a lesson that echoes beyond 1945 into every conflict since. Logistics is not support. Logistics is warfare itself, quiet and unglamorous but ultimately decisive.